Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are tuning in right now, I really want you to consider this your own personal one-on-one tutoring session. We're thrilled you're here with us because, well, our mission today is to give you a massive shortcut to mastering academic literary writing.
Right, which is something that it's a progression that can feel incredibly daunting if you've never been explicitly taught how to do it.
Exactly. So we are going to break down the exact progression of writing about literature.
Right.
We're starting from how to read actively, moving into forming a rock-solid thesis, and then culminating in how to structure a truly persuasive essay.
And for this session, we were looking specifically at Chapter 2 of a really foundational text, a short guide to writing about literature, the 12th edition. And what is so valuable about this specific chapter is that it doesn't just hand you a rubric and tell you what a good essay looks like.
Yeah, which is what usually happens.
Right. It actually walks you through the psychological and the practical steps to get there, starting before you even type a single word.
To kick things off, the chapter uses this incredible opening quote from Toni Morrison. An interviewer once asked her if she knew as a child that she wanted to be a writer. And Morrison replied, "No, I wanted to be a reader. I love that quote, but why start a chapter on writing by talking about reading?"
Because the core philosophy of this text is that learning to write is, in a very large measure, learning to read. But it goes a step further than that.
Okay, how so?
Well, the most important text you will ever read carefully is the one you write yourself. You have to learn to read your own drafts from those first messy, chaotic margin notes all the way to the final polished paragraphs with the exact same critical eye that you apply to published literature.
So you have to constantly imagine the effect your words are going to have on someone else.
Exactly. You have to step outside yourself.
So to teach this, the textbook anchors this entire process on a very short story by Kate Chopin called Ripe Figs. I read this piece before we hit record, and on the surface, it just feels like a simple, almost slice-of-life sketch about a young girl waiting for some fruit to grow. But I know I have to be missing something deeper. Walk me through what is actually happening in this story and how we're supposed to look at it.
Sure. First, the text provides a bit of necessary biographical context. Kate Chopin lived in the late 1800s. She was born into a prosperous family in St. Louis, married a French Creole businessman, and spent time in New Orleans and Louisiana.
And she started writing after her husband died, right?
Yes. After he died in 1882, she eventually returned to St. Louis and began to write fiction. That background is helpful because of the specific cultural markers she uses in her work. As for the plot of Ripe Figs, it is incredibly brief. We have an older woman, Maman Nénane, and her young goddaughter, Babette.
And Maman Nénane tells Babette she can go visit her cousins down on the Bayou La Fourche, but only when the figs are ripe.
Right. And to a young kid, that feels like an absolute eternity.
Yeah, she checks the fig trees every single day, seeing only leaves and little hard green marbles.
Precisely. Then we get this wonderful contrast. Summer arrives. We are told Maman Nénane is as patient as the statue of La Madone, while Babette is as restless as a hummingbird.
I love that imagery.
It's beautiful. Finally, the figs ripen to a deep purple. Babette dances out to the trees, and the next morning she brings her godmother a dainty porcelain platter carrying the figs. Maman Nénane is sitting there in a stately way, wearing a muslin cap that stands like an aureole about her placid face.
And she remarks on how early the figs have ripened, while Babette insists they ripened very late.
Yes, the perception of time is completely different for both of them. The story ends with Maman Nénane telling Babette to carry her love to everyone on the bayou, adding that she will look for her aunt to visit when the chrysanthemums are in bloom.
Okay, so a girl wants to visit her cousins. She waits for the figs, she gets the figs, and she gets to go. It's a sweet little story. But how does a student turn that very simple sequence of events into a formal academic essay?
This is where the text reminds us that we are reading this over a century after it was published. A writer puts meaning into a work, but as readers, we have to make an active effort to understand the context.
Right, because language shifts?
Exactly. For instance, the story uses 3 French words, maman, tante, and madone. The context makes maman and tante fairly clear, mother and aunt, but madone requires a closer look.
Because Madone means Madonna, referring to Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Yes. Now, the text points out that Chopin isn't literally saying Maman Nénane is Mary. Good writers are rarely that heavy-handed. But the reference is placed there intentionally. especially when you pair it with the word aureole later on, which is that radiant light around a sacred figure.
So if the author isn't going to just explicitly tell us that Memenenain is a revered saintly figure, how are we supposed to figure out what else they're hiding in the text? Is there a system for that?
Yes, and it involves two foundational academic concepts from the chapter that you absolutely need in your toolkit. They are indeterminacies and gaps.
Indeterminacies and gaps.
Right. Indeterminacies are passages in a text that are inherently open to interpretation. Gaps are things left completely unsaid.
So for gaps, an example would be, why does Babette live with a godmother instead of her parents? Are her parents dead? Are they just traveling?
Exactly. The text simply doesn't say that is a gap.
Can we translate that into a non-literary example just to make it stick?
Think about watching a movie trailer. You see a quick shot of a character crying in the rain, but you have no idea why. That is an indeterminacy. You have to interpret the emotion.
And maybe the trailer completely skips over the villain's backstory.
That is a gap. Your brain automatically tries to fill in that missing information based on the clues you do have.
Okay, so how do we formally fill those in when we're reading a short story or a novel?
You do it through a psychological tool the text calls consistency bolding.
Consistency bolding.
Yes. As you read, you are constantly reevaluating the details and pulling them together to make reasonable inferences. You see Memenenain acting slowly, connecting her actions to the seasons, waiting for the chrysanthemums.
You contrast that with Babette dancing, being restless as a hummingbird, checking the trees every single day.
Exactly. You're taking all these separate data points and building a consistent, logical picture of youth versus age or impatience versus the natural rhythm of time.
Which means reading cannot be a passive activity. I know when I was in college, my version of reading was just dragging a neon yellow highlighter across entire pages until the book practically glowed in the dark. But Chapter 2 practically begs you to read with a pen in hand, right?
Highlighting everything is a trap because it doesn't require any actual thought. The book shows a physical example of a student's annotated copy of Ripe Figs to demonstrate what active reading looks like.
Right, the student doesn't just highlight.
No, they circle the words hard, green marbles and draw a line connecting it to purple figs to note the contrast. When they get to the part where Babette uses a dainty porcelain platter, the student actually writes the word ceremonious with a question mark in the margin.
That is a great habit. But how do I get from writing ceremonious with a question mark in the margin to actually drafting a 5-page paper?
Yeah.
That still feels like a massive leap.
It is a massive leap, which is why you shouldn't try to make it all at once. The next step the text outlines is recording your first responses.
So journaling, basically.
Yes, you move from those margin notes to a journal or blank document, and you just start free writing. You're essentially talking to yourself about the story.
The textbook actually includes some examples of this student journaling. Let me read a quick piece of one. A student wrote, I like the way Babette and MN are sort of opposite. B sings and dances and is restless. On the other hand, MN is patient and like a statue. But, come to think of it, B can also be dignified. She serves MN the figs in a fancy dish.
And another student jotted down, I can tell they are not poor, the pointed silver fruit knife and the porcelain platter, they are the leisure class.
Now, looking at those, they are pretty messy. Why not just skip this and go straight to making a formal outline for the essay?
Because skipping to the outline raises the stakes too high too fast. The tutoring takeaway here is that at this stage, you should absolutely not be worrying about perfect grammar, thesis statements, or formatting. You are simply letting the story trigger your imagination.
You're panning for gold.
Right, looking for ideas that ring true to you. For instance, one of the students realizes through this messy free writing that Memenenain might be teaching Babette that anticipation is as much fun as the trip itself. That raw, unstructured impression is the exact seed that will eventually grow into a strong academic argument.
Okay, so we have our messy journal thoughts. We have found a few golden nuggets of ideas. Now we have to transition to the actual writing phase.
Yeah.
And the very first question the text asks is, who are you writing for? Who is your audience?
The natural instinct for any student is to say, well, I am writing for my professor, but the text explicitly calls that a misconception.
It does.
It offers a crucial paradigm shift, a sort of golden rule for writers. It says, you may think you're writing for the teacher, but this view is a misconception. When you write, you are the teacher.
Hold on. I need to push back on that a little bit. How can I possibly be the teacher when the professor grading my paper literally holds a PhD in this exact topic. Doesn't adopting that mindset feel incredibly arrogant?
It feels counterintuitive, I know, but it's a necessary mental model. If you write under the assumption that your reader, the professor, already knows everything about the text, you will start skipping crucial steps in your logic.
Oh, because I'll just assume they get it.
Exactly. You won't explain your points fully because you'll think, oh, they already know what this quote means. By adopting the mindset that you are the teacher, you force yourself to lay out every single piece of evidence clearly.
You treat your audience as a collaborator?
Right. Perhaps imagining a classroom of your peers. If they haven't read the story, you know you need to provide a bit of summary. If they have read it, you know you need to focus entirely on persuading them of your specific interpretation. Either way, you are the one guiding them.
I want to see this mental model in action because the textbook gives us a fantastic tool here. It provides a sample assignment, which is to summarize the action and explain what makes ripe figs interesting. Then it gives us a complete student essay by a writer named Antonia Tenori.
Let's break down exactly how she constructed this essay so we can replicate her success. Let's analyze her approach piece by piece.
It starts before the first paragraph with the title. Antonia titled her paper, Images of Ripening in Kate Chopin's Ripe Figs.
Which is so much better than just calling it an analysis of ripe figs or essay 1. It is informative. It signals to the reader exactly what the central theme of the paper is going to be before they even read the first sentence.
Next, we get to one of the hardest balancing acts in literary writing: summary versus analysis. Students constantly struggle with how much plot summary is too much.
In her opening paragraph, Antonia gives just enough summary, mentioning Mama Nene and telling Bet she can visit her cousins when the figs ripen to establish the context. But she does not linger there. She uses that single sentence of summary as a launch pad.
So basically, she provides just enough background to make her analysis intelligible to someone who maybe hasn't read the story in a few years, and then she immediately pivots to her thesis.
And her thesis is where we see the power of that earlier free writing exercise. She writes that while the story seems like a simple character sketch contrasting youth and age, Chopin is actually using natural imagery to suggest that human maturity, like nature's seasons, happens in its own time.
She took a basic observation about patience and elevated it into a formal, arguable thesis.
Exactly.
Now, what about the evidence? I'll confess, when I had to hit a strict word count in college, I would just drop giant half-page block quotes into the middle of my paragraphs and hope the professor thought I was being thorough.
The text strongly warns against doing exactly that. Quotations are not supposed to be used as wallpaper to cover up a lack of original thought. Antonia uses brief, highly targeted quotes.
Like pointing out that Babette is tender as the fig leaves.
Yes, and noting the aureole around the godmother's face. She integrates these specific words into her own sentences. They act as hard architectural support for her argument, demonstrating the exact contrast she claims exists.
And then there is the conclusion. We have all written the deadliest kind of conclusion imaginable, the one that starts with, "Thus we have seen," and just repeats the introduction almost word for word.
You want to avoid the estate, "Thus we have seen trap at all costs." An essay is a journey. If your conclusion just drops the reader off exactly where they started, the journey feels pointless.
So what did Antonia do instead?
Her final paragraph introduces a new idea that logically follows from all the analysis she just did. She concludes by arguing that Chopin's use of natural imagery connects the reader to the rhythms of the seasons in an intimate way. It pushes the discussion a step further.
Let me translate that into a quick, plain-spoken rule. Don't just hit copy-paste on your intro. Give the reader a little something extra for their trouble on the way out the door.
That is exactly right. The text also includes a crucial note about how assignment length dictates the depth of your analysis.
Like a one-page paper versus a five-page paper.
Yes. If you're asked to write a 1 or 2 page paper, you have to be incredibly direct. You only have space to present the details that immediately support your main thesis. However, if you're tasked with a 3 to 5 page paper, you suddenly have the runway to explore the setting, the minor characters, and the central themes in much greater depth.
Which brings up a second major rule for writers that the text emphasizes.
Yes. You must always assume your readers are skeptical. You cannot just tell them your interpretation and expect them to believe you. You have to show them the exact word, the exact imagery on the page that led you to that conclusion. Your job is to persuade a skeptic.
So after going through all these mechanics, hunting for gaps, building consistency, analyzing every word choice there, is sometimes this lingering fear among students. Doesn't tearing a story apart to look for aureoles and indeterminacies just ruin the magic of reading it? Doesn't it kill the fun?
It's a very common fear, But the textbook argues the exact opposite. Think about a magic trick. If you just watch it passively, you are entertained for a moment. But if you take the time to understand the mechanics of the trick, how the illusion was crafted, your appreciation for the magician's skill actually deepens.
That makes a lot of sense.
Analysis is a special form of critical thinking. By getting inside the story, by figuring out how its style, structure, and themes operate, you appreciate the craftsmanship on a much deeper level. When you test your initial emotional responses against the hard evidence of the text, your thinking becomes sharper. You aren't destroying the story, you're illuminating it.
Okay, let's recap the key mental models and hacks we've uncovered today from Chapter 2. We started with the necessity of active reading, ditching the passive highlighter for a pen to spot gaps and indeterminacies. We discussed how to use consistency building to make logical sense of those gaps.
Right, and moving from messy marginal notes to low-stakes free writing to find our best ideas.
Then we tackled that massive psychological shift, remembering that when you sit down to write, you are the teacher, not the student. Finally, we broke down how to form a thesis that elevates an observation into an argument, how to use brief quotes as hard evidence rather than padding, and how to write a conclusion that actually pushes the idea forward.
It is a comprehensive system that takes the mystery out of academic writing. And it leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Because these academic concepts are not just confined to literature, they map perfectly onto your daily life.
Really? How so?
Think about the text messages or emails you receive every single day. They are completely full of gaps and indeterminacies, a delayed response from a friend, a period at the end of a very short sentence from your boss, an unusual or ambiguous emoji.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we analyze those constantly.
Exactly. How much of your daily communication relies on the exact same consistency building we just talked about? If you apply the skills of close reading to the real world, what hidden meanings or perhaps what misunderstandings might you uncover in the messages you interact with every day?
That is such a fascinating point to mull over. The skills you learn analyzing a short story from the 1800s really do dictate how we decode the world around us right now. Thank you so much for tuning in to this deep dive. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, we hope this section gives you the confidence and the mental tools to tackle your next literary essay head-on. Happy reading and happy writing.